Thanks, Juan. Great presentation. I'm equally pleased to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Victor Pike. Dr. Pike obtained his PhD in cell biology and neuroscience from Georgetown University, where he studied autonomic reflexes after a spinal cord injury. Since 2002, he's a scientist at neuroengineering program of the Huntington Medical Research Institute. Also, since 2010, he has an assistant professor of ophthalmology at USC. Additionally, he's a consultant for bioelectronic R&D unit of GSK.
As you've heard, this area of bioelectronic medicine is a new field. The term itself was actually just coined last year, and I think we're actually maybe witnessing emergence of a new medical industry. Imagine like 20 years ago when the cardiovascular surgery or like stents were coming around. They were also not very big, but I think there is actually a big potential in this. And I'm really happy that I've been involved in this effort since inception. Since last year, I was tapped by GSK to lead one of the projects. As Juan Pablo mentioned, we have more than 30 projects currently ongoing. And in addition to doing one of the R&D projects for GSK, I'm also consulting them on technology. So I have this dual role with GSK, and actually the rest of the speakers in this session also to some degree funded by GSK, and that's not surprising because GSK has really led the effort in this area. And as Juan Pablo just mentioned, there are two other key players emerging right now is the NIH, with their Spark program, which actually, even though it's been announced, but there are no calls for applications yet. So if you're interested in this area, the calls will be released probably early next year. So it will be a good opportunity for companies. And they specifically said they're interested in companies involvement, not just researchers from academia. And DARPA is also very interested in this, and they're actually also very interested in company involvements in this. And LA area is actually very invested in this area, in this field of research, as you will hear from the next talks as well. So this picture just kind of symbolizes what we're hoping to do is to replace some of the drugs with these very small implantable devices. This is a cartoon just showing some possible implementation of what bioelectronic medicine is. It's essentially a closed loop modulation of sympathetic or parasympathetic nerves. And what you would do is you would have some kind of sensor that would detect some kind of state in there, some organ. In this case, just looking at blood glucose level, or it could be something else, looking at some long-term factor in the health or in disease, and using that information for modulating a nerve that innervates that specific organ that's diseased. And this is just a picture of one of our cuff electrodes on a very small nerve. Just to give you an idea of the scale here, this nerve is 0.5 millimeter in diameter. So a year ago, there were no devices that you could even, were no cuffs available. So this year, we actually saw emergence of technology for just this purpose, for these very, very small nerves. And some of the nerves we're working with are as small as a human hair or smaller. So we really have to develop this new technology from the ground. Just to give you an idea of what the ideal bioelectronic medicine device will be and how it's different from what we have right now is if you look in the blue box, which is the non-implantable biochemical diagnostics, that's what we currently use point-of-care devices in the clinic. What they do is they measure different parameters of specific organs or cells, but it takes a few minutes, sometimes hours, to collect data. So it's not really real time in terms of seconds. Secondly, it's usually limited to looking at molecules or cells level. Then if you look at the green box, this is where physiology currently is non-implantable. And as you can see, it mostly works at the level of tissue to organ to the body. And again, because we're usually doing these measurements at the office, the duration of time of monitoring is limited to minutes to hours. So bioelectronic medicine has several features that are unique. First of all, it will combine biochemistry and physiology, so you can actually do fast as well as kind of slow signals, but also you can look at spatial resolution from molecules to the whole body monitoring. And most importantly, you can deliver therapy, in this case neuromodulation, at very fast, rapid on-demand fashion, but at the same time you can do long-term monitoring of. So the key here is fast, at the same time long-term. So combining these two things is actually essential for this technology to work. And depending on the disease, you would like to monitor either immune or endocrine or metabolic functions. So since this is an investment conference, I would like to spend a little bit of time on the issue of money. So I think the bioelectronic medicine can address some of the issues that are emerging in unsustainable growth with U.S. healthcare costs and also global healthcare costs. As shown on this chart, now we spend more than 15% of our GDP on healthcare costs, and if we don't change anything, this will grow even further by 2050, estimated to be more than 30%, close to 40%. So what are we doing currently? Development of a new drug, including all the costs, is about $1 billion, and that's actually a conservative estimate, including some failed drugs. Let's compare this to developing a new small implantable medical device. Currently, based on current estimates, it's about $50 to $100 million, including the FDA process. And the process tends to be a little shorter. It also easier to repurpose these devices from one nerve to another for different clinical applications. Also, a difference from a drug is where you can actually have embedded electronics in this device, so it can have a patient-specific therapy, so it can be tuned for this individual patient. And the systemic side effects are eliminated because you have very localized action, so you have selectivity and specificity that you cannot get with drugs, usually, especially the ones that are taken orally. So just to give you some ideas where this might be going. Again, as I should mention, this is very early, so we will see a lot emergence of new companies in years to come, but at this point, the research is being done on both parasympathetic and sympathetic neuromodulation. So you can see this is just the tip of the iceberg that I'm showing here, some of the key disorders that can be targeted. And for each of these disorders, I'm showing the number of patients in the US and globally. As you can see, these are staggering numbers. So this is potentially, this will have a big influence on how the medicine is administered in the future for most of the disorders. So this is I think really could be groundbreaking if if the advances in technology can provide these treatments. So my last slide is just to show you what kind of advances we need and we're working on right now. We need three basically things. We need nerve front end, which is essentially an electrode. I've shown you one of them as a cuff electrode, but it could be some other device that actually is connected, somehow touching the nerve or somehow affecting the nerve activity, either by electrically, optically, ultrasound, using microwave energy, some kind of interaction with the nerve. Then you also need to be able to detect activity of the organ. So it could be electrochemistry, magnetic, optical, mechanical biosensors, detecting all kinds of biosensing relevant moieties, chemical moieties. And finally, there is a big push right now to develop the back end, which is the electronics that will support this, which is data and power telemetry. And the key issue here is making this at the sub-centimeter scale, because we already know that we can do this telemetry in large, bulky IPG kind of modules. But if we can do it in small devices like shown at the bottom here, that would really revolutionize. We also need low noise, low power amplifiers, again, very small, miniaturized. We'll need on-board, on-chip signal processing and communication, because you need to be able to talk between the stimulating device and recording devices, biosensors, to do non-demand neuromodulation. And finally, hermetic packaging at small scale can be a big issue. And so those are the key issues that we're working on right now to provide this future. And during the discussion, we can talk more specific disorders if you're interested. Thank you.
While we're working on this, I would like to make an introduction, and before I do that, I'll introduce myself, which Sean did earlier. Michael Langhout. I'm the president and CEO of Solari Medical Technology. And our company is focused on disorders of the auditory processing system. And so right now we're working on our device, which will deliver high-rate pulse trains to the auditory nerve. And our indication is chronic tinnitus. I'd like to introduce Dr. Jeffrey Ardell. Dr. Ardell is professor of medicine at UCLA, and he received his PhD in physiology from the University of Washington in Seattle. Go Huskies. By the way, that's where our company is located. He is also director of Neuro Cardiology Research Center of Excellence at UCLA, and he is author of several books in neurocardiology and numerous recent publications in this field. He's also a member of several associations, including the American Heart Association, and many distinguished awards. So thank you, and with that I'd like to introduce Dr. Ardell.
All right. All right, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about so what. I mean, we're sitting here talking about the possibilities of autonomic regulation therapy, which is what we've called it. And, whoops, where are we going here? All right. And basically, I've been in this field for close to 20 years now, actually 40 years, I'm sorry. This is my disclosures. I get funding from a number of private companies, consulting for other ones. I am part of the GSK initiative. And what I'd like you to know first is, when I say so what, we are in the field which is called Neuro Cardiology, which is basically understanding how does your nervous system interact with your heart in normal and pathological conditions. First thing I want you to appreciate is control of your heart involves nerves which are in your brainstem, your spinal cord, and your chest. They are quite well optimized into networks which are normally very effective at meeting normal stresses when you exercise, when you stand up, but they can be catastrophically disrupted by cardiac disease, and that's what we're actually going after. Those individuals which show the excessive sympathetic response are at high risk for sudden cardiac death and going into heart failure. This is an example of what happens when you have a heart attack. Basically, you get an ischemic part in your heart, decreased cardiac performance, that makes heart rate go faster. You perceive cardiac pain, you get a sympathetic response. The heart beats faster and stronger as a result of it. That makes the heart work harder, and that contributes to the ischemia, and it's essentially a dog chasing its tail, and you get a high risk for sudden cardiac death as a result of this procedure. This is an example of what happens when you have a heart attack. You can see in the top panel blood pressure, left ventricular pressure, and as Victor was talking about, we actually have the ability to go in and record nerve activity from various parts of your cardiac nervous system, and you can here see the substantial increase in activity of the nervous system as you go into the heart attack. And you can see on the right-hand panel there, essentially the heart fibrillated, pressure goes to zero, and that's unless you resuscitate that patient, he's going to die. Basically what happens is that in this room, I call it the rule of thirds. If all of us had the same heart attack right now, 1/3 of us would die within 15 to 20 minutes. 1/3 are going to survive that first insult, and the next time they're going to die. And 1/3 of us we get hit with a freight train, and we go on fine. We're trying to figure out who are the ones that are at high risk for disease, and what we can do to change it. One of the ways we've dealt with this in the past is we put in implantable cardiac defibrillators. This is essentially a Band-Aid. It can treat the symptom, can reverse the ventricular fibrillation, but not the root cause. Now, standard of care for management of arrhythmia is basically implantable cardiac defibrillators, their cardiac ablation therapies, and their pharmacological approach. The pharmacological drugs to blunt the sympathetic response. The problem is 40% of our patients within 2 years basically have a recurrence of the event. So this is a very high failure rate. And what we're proposing as part of this Neuro Cardiology program is to do a paradigm shift to focus on neural heart-brain interactions. And here at UCLA, we have the ability to assess various levels of your nervous system from the brain with imaging techniques to direct recording from your brainstem, from your chest, and from your heart, and compare that with very high-density maps of your heart function. And that has actually given us a real strong ability to mechanistically treat your heart disease. This is a schematic which sort of takes the Netter diagram one step further, shows how your nervous system is organized. Basically, this just, as I said, summarizes, you've got nerves in your brain and your chest which control it, and by specifically targeting various parts of this nervous system, you can treat heart disease. I'm going to talk about 3 of these aspects. The first is spinal cord stimulation, the second is vagal stimulation, and the third is some of the surgical techniques we have at our disposal. This basically shows spinal cord stimulation. We talked about that briefly here. The main thing I want you to get from this is that spinal cord stimulation basically is a way where you can quiet the sympathetic nervous system, which is the top panel. You can see on the next panel on the bottom part there that we can reduce the risk of sudden cardiac death from 40% down to 10%. And on the bottom panel, we can actually preserve your heart muscle. So in response to having spinal cord stimulation on board, we can keep muscle in your heart alive, and we can reduce the chances of you dying of sudden cardiac death. This is another approach we do. This is for patients with very significant rhythm disorders in their heart. That's the number of ICD shocks these patients were getting. You can see some of these patients were getting 2 to 3 shocks a day. If you've ever seen a patient that gets an ICD shock, it's quite a significant event. We have actually pioneered a therapy where we go in and surgically deal with certain aspects of the sympathetic nervous system by removing it and taking care of the arrhythmias. You can see that the number of shocks have gone from 2 per day down to an average of about 0.1 per day. Now, in terms of the next phase we're also dealing with, this has to do with treatment of heart failure. We have various models where we can go in and induce hypertension or myocardial ischemia. This is a type of neuromodulation device. This is for vagal nerve stimulation. And what I'd like to show out here is what this panel shows. I won't get into all the specifics of it, but the main point being here is that when you have a heart attack or you have hypertension, your heart gets bigger, and you start to go into heart failure. If you have the neuromodulation therapy on, in this case with vagal nerve stimulation, you can essentially prevent that. And this is the results of 2 recent clinical studies that there's 3 major studies ongoing right now in terms of autonomic regulation therapy, specifically vagal nerve stimulation for heart failure. There's the study with Medtronics, which is on the left. This is basically in clinical trials right now, and they basically show that if you have a patient with reduced cardiac output heart failure, if you put on the vagal nerve stimulation, you can actually help preserve cardiac function. The next one next to it is the Anthem Trial, which was just presented at the European Society for Cardiology, and they showed essentially the same thing, that you can actually preserve cardiac function in the setting of heart failure. Now, why is that important? If you've got a patient in heart failure and their heart function's going down like this, if you can do this, to their benefit, if we could do this, it's even better, and that's the goal of what we're going on. The last point I'd like to bring up here is when you're talking about what you need to do when you're going into this field, you need to be very intelligent and understand what you're doing. When you do this electrical pharmaceuticals, when you push the system in one way, it's going to push back. And what you see on this figure right here is an example of the 3 major studies which are going on right now with vagal nerve stimulation: Nectar, which is Boston Scientific; Anthem, which is Cyberonics; and Innovate, which is Medtronics. Nectar and Anthem presented at European Society for Cardiology. Nectar came up with a neutral response, and the reason it was a neutral response is because what they did when they established their parameter sets is they parked their patients actually in one of the worst parts of the vagal stimulation curve. They put it where they were inducing tachycardias instead of bradycardias. The Anthem, actually, which is the one I was associated with, was at the 10 hertz, which is operating right along a zone where you actually have very effective control, and Medtronics is actually on a similar area. So if you design your study wrong, you're going to spend a lot of money and not get the outcome that you want. So my main message to you as venture capitalists and people going forward in the device industry is understand the physiology, understand the pathology, and then you can design what the appropriate therapy is. And in that regard, this is what we have established at UCLA, which is an incredible resource which you have just in your backyard. This is basically what we've set up, the Neuro Cardiology Research Center of Excellence at UCLA. It's actually the first center in the entire world in neurocardiology. We have capabilities for evaluating autonomic nervous system, very high degree specificity for cardiac substrate changes, molecular biology. We've got a very important imaging core which can look at brain and spinal cord function. We do network modeling, and more importantly, we have complementary divisions in the research and clinical fields which are identical and cross-fertilize each other quite dramatically. So we actually can go from bench to bedside and back to bench in a matter of hours. And that's actually been very important for us. But on that note, I'd be glad to talk with anyone after we get done with this about some opportunities available at UCLA, and I appreciate the time to talk to you.